This is the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live, where we offer the entertainment, sports, weather, traffic, news, and information that our commercial drivers want to hear. Identity theft is a serious problem, and no one's immune from identity thieves or companies and organizations that track you for their data mining. When you're using mobile and electronic devices, you and your information is vulnerable. Drivers work from mobile devices exclusively today with e-logs and other types of activities, and data is the new gold. And everything we do online is gathered and placed into a massive database that tells a story about us and potentially can violate our privacy. This is how push ads occur, with companies blasting us with information we don't always want, or they can track us with an app on our mobile device. How do we protect ourselves? Today we have a digital identity expert. Adam Judelson is the president and COO of mePrism. mePrism believes that your online data is your property and you have a natural right to privacy. Welcome, Adam. I really appreciate you being on the show with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So I guess we could start with, what is mePrism? What do you folks do? And what do people need to know about digital identity?
Sure. So, to start out at its simplest form, mePrism is a company that is dedicated to helping the consumer take control of their data again. So, as you were just mentioning in the intro bit, the consumer's data is spread all over the internet in all of the different companies that we interact with databases. So, Google has some, Amazon has some, Walmart has some, Pinterest has it. Any of the websites that we're used to interacting with are storing information about what we click on, what we search for, what we look for, what we view, where we physically move throughout the universe. All of those things are, for the most part, recorded and captured. And at the moment, there's really no way for the consumer, you or me, to actually go look at that data and then take control of it. And once you have control of it, what we find is that a lot of people are also interested in making money from it and profiting from that data because it is, in fact, an asset. And so kind of one of the ways in which the market has become skewed over time is that data is actually bought and sold without our permission in the market every single day. And it's bought by large companies that are paying for the advertisements that you were talking about. It's bought by data brokers. And at the moment, there's no way besides an app or a product like mePrism to be able to go take control of that data and then sell it yourself if you're interested in doing that.
And I don't think a lot of people think about it. You see people on Facebook and all over the place, and not everybody's mindful of everything you do is being monitored.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's very pervasive. What we've noticed is that the average consumer has had approximately 30,000 individual data points collected on them, and it's very granular. It can be every single time you touch your Nest thermostat and change the temperature, to every Google search that you conduct, to every playlist that you curate in a music app or listen to on the radio. All of those things are being captured, and not necessarily for nefarious purposes. They're used generally to improve the personalization experience of the app that you're using. But
Hmm.
it is prolific and much more than most of us realize. I mean, I've had a whole career in data and data startups, and even I was surprised when I joined mePrism to see the full extent of the information that is being captured in the consumer side.
Can somebody go out and actually find out what people have collected on them?
Yeah, that's one of the really exciting things, and one of the reasons why mePrism is happening just at the right time in the market is that in Europe they passed the GDPR, which is their sort of landmark privacy piece of legislation, and right around the same time, California passed its own version of a comprehensive piece of privacy legislation. And one of the key provisions in that legislation, and something that we're seeing starting to be repeated across different states across the United States, is the right to ask for your data back. And so each company now, above a certain revenue threshold, generally it's around $25 million of revenue, or companies that make most of their money from data sales, are actually required by law to give the consumer the ability to go request that information and then take control of it. The tricky bit is that when you receive that information, it's generally given to you in a format that's not particularly easy to exploit or understand if you're a regular person who doesn't spend their day, writing Python code or at a computer
Right.
terminal.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So basically people are in the dark. And I don't think the average person, that's a lot of data. What you were saying, the average data points that have been gathered on each individual, that is a lot. I mean, what would that encompass? Did you say 30,000?
Yeah, that's right, 30,000. And some of those are of the same category. For example, every transaction that you have on an online service, you might have hundreds of those. So it's not necessarily 30,000 different categories. We've broken down the user profile into about 600 individual sort of categories of information. One category could be, for example, your Facebook posts. One category could be your Google searches. One category could be the friends that you've identified on the various social networks.
How do people stay safe? I know that I have some friends who love the little games they have on Facebook. It's like, what kind of personality of a cat? If you were a cat, and people plug in answers, not realizing their responses are being collected, and this actually leaves them vulnerable.
Yeah, it absolutely does leave folks vulnerable, especially for times when there are data breaches, which, as we know, are only growing in occurrence. And on the one hand, security is getting a lot better, but it really is a cat and mouse game in the cybersecurity world to always be ahead of the latest vulnerabilities. And I'm sure that people have seen that there's a new vulnerability related to Log4j, which is a very weedy thing that we don't have to get into here. But the bottom line is there's a very prolific piece of code that is used over and over again across just about every app on the planet. And hackers have recently found a vulnerability in it. So we need to be conscious of this risk. And, when you think about what can you do about it, there are a couple of options, right? And you kind of have to consider the extremes first. Option one is we meet a lot of people, a lot of users who are not worried about the privacy side of things, and they're just interested in the monetization aspect, and that's fabulous. If you're not worried about it, you're not worried about it. On the other side of things, you've got people who are concerned that every single data point might be used against them. And I think for our own sanity, we have to steer a delicate balance because there really is no way to interact in the modern world without some data capture. But what you can do is thoughtfully go through the sites that you use the most and check out their privacy policies and check out their privacy settings. And one of the things that we do at mePrism is that for the biggest tech giants, starting with Google and Facebook, we give the user control in the app to be able to set their preferences for whether that information is actually captured. And a lot of people don't realize that for the most part, you can still continue to use many of these apps. You just don't get a personalized experience if you use the apps outside of their natural habitat, if you will. You may not get high quality targeted advertisements, and that is part of the trade-off, and that's part of the challenge for the consumer, is to decide how important it is to them to see a relevant ad weighed against the risk profile that they're willing to accept in the market with regards to this data being found by others. At the same time, I will add, I spent the first part of my career in the national security space. Looking at what our foreign enemies are doing and how to protect ourselves and supporting our troops overseas and that sort of thing. And I will just say, from my experience, the average person doesn't need to be as concerned about somebody nefarious necessarily looking for all of their individual data points. It is important to protect that information, but sometimes we see people who have almost become paralyzed in their ability to operate because they're concerned that, the Russian hackers, for example, are looking for their address. And certainly some of the time that is true. And certainly some of the time that is the way that exploits work. But at the same time, the average American is not really a target of some of these things. It's more common that you end up in a large data breach. And then the question is, what happens later. And often what happens is no one ever looks at your data. And sometimes someone looks at your data, and sometimes someone looks at your data years later and then sends you, a phishing ad or something like that to try to get control. And so you can't really keep your brain in high vigilance mode the entire time. And so that's why I really recommend that people go in and change the settings, their personalization settings, either through mePrism or through the actual apps themselves to set up a thoughtful set of defaults so that the information you are comfortable with sharing with the brands you're comfortable sharing it with is available, and the data that you're not comfortable sharing just is not out there.
That makes a lot of sense. I don't think a lot of people realize everything that's being done and how to protect themselves. And I know personally, I don't like push ads. And when you have any of that open where people, for instance, if I have Facebook open, I close it so it can't track me. I don't want those ads. That's one way I guess you could get around it, but it sounds like you have some better solutions that could be an all-in-one.
For sure, yeah. I mean, the easiest thing to do is we've sort of aggregated as many of the privacy controls as we can get access to as we grow the product and add more data sources. So you can control those from one place in the mePrism app, and you can decide at a pretty granular level what kind of tracking is okay with you and what kind of tracking is not okay with you. Because, like you said, there is a trade-off. It is kind of up to you to decide what amount of personalization is beneficial to you and what amount of personalization is not beneficial. And mePrism as a company is not trying to take a stand on that. What we're trying to take a stand on is that we believe that the consumer should actually be at the center of that decision-making process, that it should be up to you. If you want to see targeted ads all day long, that's your prerogative. If you don't want to see those, that's something that you should be empowered to control as quickly and easily as possible. And unfortunately, it's not set up in a way where you can just turn them all off at once, without the assistance of a product.
Sure. Well, this is exciting because it puts the control back in the hands of the user where it needs to be. We have to go to break here. I can't wait to ask you more questions. You're a wealth of information, Adam. This is the Truckers Network radio show. I'm Shelley Johnson. We'll be back with more right here on tncradio.live coming up. Great leaders challenge their people not to stop at the first right answer. Tighten the Lug Nuts is the book that will help you move past that first right answer to be more effective, more productive, and more successful. This book serves as a blueprint that can be easily applied by leaders, entrepreneurs, truckers, owner-operators, all of us in our everyday lives. This is one of the best leadership books you can read to help you accelerate towards your personal and professional goals. Plus, a portion of the proceeds will be donated to truckerschristmasgroup.org. Visit TightenTheLugNuts.com to order your copy today. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show here on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and we're talking with digital identity expert Adam Judelson from mePrism. He's been giving us all kinds of information that's fascinating about data, how it's collected. The number of data points collected on individuals is pretty amazing. Adam, where can people find mePrism, and what exactly are you doing for customers? You said that it's being rolled out in a number of places.
Yeah, sure. The easiest place to find mePrism is just our website, www.meprism.com. But ultimately, the product is in open beta now and available in the iOS App Store. And our team is working hurriedly at the moment to make it ready for the Android Google Play Store as well. And if you're interested in the Google Play Store on our website, you'll see a link to sign up for the waiting list for that. And we'll make sure to notify folks early in the new year to get access. And what you're going to see when you get into the app is an experience that first helps you to claim your data. That's really the very first step. If you don't have access to your data and you can't put it into your sort of data bank, as we like to call it, then you can't really take the next step. The first step is to go find all the places on the internet where this data exists on you and gather it. And that's kind of the first big thing that mePrism assists you with. The second thing that we do is once you have that information, we want to educate everybody about what is in the data. Because one of the really interesting things about the data is that it's so expansive that it's very difficult to summarize. And so what we found is when you're asking people how to value this asset, the asset of their data, it's difficult to do so because imagine, to try to make a practical example that's kind of silly, imagine somebody said that they wanted to buy your house and you had never actually walked through your entire house, or your house had hundreds of bedrooms that you had never even seen before. It would be very difficult for you to put a value on that house and say, hey, this is how much it actually means to me. Well, the same thing happens with our personal data, and it happens at an order of magnitude of 1,000 times more complicated than something like understanding what's actually in your house. So we have this entire educational experience called the data story, which kind of teaches you a couple of things about your data, some of the locations that you've been, some of the predictions that can be made. For example, does the data indicate that you're a Democrat or a Republican? Does the data indicate that you likely have a low credit score or a high credit score? These are all things that the large tech companies out there are trying to guess about all of us. And they're doing it behind the scenes, right? So there's that educational experience. We've also got some fun features in there that help the consumer to understand what the large companies might think about their personality. So we have a quiz in there that allows you to kind of see what your personality is. And then we also will compare those quiz results to what the data says you are. So you may think and answer the questions a particular way, but your data may actually be indicating an entirely different story from what you feel is actually inside of you. And then we've got the privacy controls that we talked about, which allow you to basically control how much data is being captured by Google or Facebook or the other tech giants out there. And of course, the marketplace. The marketplace is the centerpiece of the app for anyone who's interested in selling their data. We help you to find qualified buyers who will ask your permission to buy the data and buy only what they have said they'll buy, and will deliver only precisely what you allow them to see. Which again is an optional piece of the product, but we find a lot of people are very interested in making some money from it. So that's kind of what's in the app.
So all of a sudden, we can reclaim our data as a value and a currency and make some money off of it because, after all, it's about us.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, this is the data that made Google and Facebook some of the most valuable companies on the planet.
And some of the richest.
Some of the richest. And as a result, but other companies haven't had access to that data. So there are a lot of willing and interested buyers out there who would like to have our information, but they want to ask our permission. And that's the new model that we're trying to set a standard for, is that the permission is requested before anything happens with your data.
Well, that makes absolute sense. And I mean, you're talking about different things, the different conclusions these companies come to. It could be so incorrect. And I know a lot of companies that are hiring will look at this sort of data. And can't that impact whether somebody gets hired? I mean, it could have some real wild ramifications and consequences, couldn't it?
Absolutely. It's so important to think about what information is out there. I actually applied for a job 3 or 4 years ago where at the end of the interview process, they presented me with a data collection link from a company they were partnered with that wanted just an insane amount of information. And I declined the job on the grounds of that collection, because what you don't know, and what I think is concerning to the consumer, is that in the current market, when someone has your data, there aren't nice and neat restrictions around how that data gets passed from the second person who has it to the third person, to the fourth person, to the fifth person. So you think you're going into business with one company that has that information, or worse, they've acquired it without your permission entirely through a data broker. And then it gets sold to somebody who you've never even had a relationship with in the first place. And so, back to your kind of original question, sort of one of the themes of today's discussion is, it really is important to think carefully. Hey, if this piece of information became semi-public, meaning it was available to all of the corporations that might be interested in me, do I think this helps me or hurts me, or is it neutral? Right. And, there's certain pieces of information, for example, I've decided, I have kids and I'm comfortable saying that on the air. I'm comfortable saying that to Facebook. I'm comfortable saying that in all of the forums, but I'm not comfortable talking about their ages. I don't talk about their names. I don't talk about their birthdays, right? Because once that information gets out there, it's very hard to get control over it again.
How much do people pay for this kind of information? Do you have like a price point or?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a complicated answer because it depends on how much you're selling and it depends on who you're selling it to. One of the interesting things we found is that a lot of people are actually willing to give some of their data away for free on one end of the spectrum if it benefits a cause they really care about. For example, a cancer survivor may be willing to contribute some of their data, perhaps their heart rate and some health vitals, back to researchers who are looking to do new work that makes it safer for people who come down with a particular ailment. On the other extreme, you have professional athletes whose data may be worth tens of thousands of dollars. Somewhere in the middle, we find that the average consumer's data, we've seen a lot of transactions occur from around $5 through around $20 or $25 per use of the data. So sometimes when I say that, people think, oh, that's not very much money. But what you have to remember is once you get into the marketplace, your data can be sold if you want to sell it for as many times as you want. Right. So you could potentially work with 50 or 100 different corporates in a year and make 5, 10, 15, $20 for each of those transactions. What we see in the existing markets for data, which are through the data brokers, your data goes for only a few pennies per transaction, maybe 10, 15, 50 cents. And the reason that they can sell it so cheaply is because they don't have your consent. They never actually paid the person who's responsible for that data for the right to use it. And as the law changes and as consumer preferences in the market change, it becomes increasingly untolerated by the consumer to allow that to happen. We actually did some research that found that consumers are willing to accept an inferior brand. Like if you think of, for example, ice cream, if you think of, and I won't name specific names because I don't want to denigrate a brand on the show, but if you think that, we can all agree there are some ice creams that taste better and some that don't taste as good. And we did research that basically found that consumers would be willing to eat the inferior product if they knew that the company that they were dealing with had acquired their data from them directly instead of buying it on these data markets.
Interesting. Now, is this the privacy paradox that you were referring to, or?
It's related. It's related. So the privacy paradox is this concept that consumers, when asked if they value their privacy, will almost always say that it's very, very important to them. But on the other hand, the moment that you offer somebody 50 cents or $2 for a piece of information, they're immediately willing to sell out their grandmother's address, right? And so, yeah, so we kind of have this paradox where people say data privacy is really important to them, but then they don't actually take the action to back it up. And mePrism believes that this paradox is a farce. We don't believe that there really is a paradox. What we believe is that there is a massive information asymmetry, that people just don't know what's in their data. So we've run a couple of studies, and we're actually getting ready to run an even larger national level study that basically disproves this paradox. And what we did was we basically went out and found people who were willing to sell their data, and we bought it from them. And then we brought them through an educational experience, showing them not only what's actually in it, hey, we have this particular Google search from you, we have this particular friend list from you, but also showing them what could be predicted about them based on that data, their personality, their credit score, their political affiliations. We even have a metric in there for the likelihood of the person to engage in criminal activity. And that's something that's backed up by empirical academic research, right? So it's possible to make these predictions in a statistically significant manner. Now, mePrism is not in the business of making those predictions, but the corporations who are buying your data are. And what we found when we compiled all this data together is that the average consumer doesn't believe there's a privacy paradox at all. In fact, the more they know about their data, perhaps unsurprisingly, when you state it this way, the more money that they want for the data, the more important they feel it is, and the more that they deserve to be compensated in their eyes. And so that's something that we're trying to help the consumer do, is get educated and then be able to transact at the levels that they feel are fair for the data.
Makes absolute sense. I mean, when you think about what's collected, and most people don't think about it, it's kind of like somebody going through your house and looking in every nook and cranny and every single bit of family history. I mean, it really is. You wouldn't let somebody in to do that, you know?
No, you certainly wouldn't. And I think, when I first started getting involved in data privacy issues, I remember kind of asking myself, well, but if you don't have anything to hide, dot, 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 what's the big deal, right? And one of the most compelling things that I came across in the literature as I was coming up to speed on data privacy over the years is that part of the reason that it's so important to protect our privacy in these nooks and corners in your house or in these nooks and corners of our data digital footprint is that we need the freedom to think without other people judging the intermediate thoughts that ultimately lead to the creativity and the freedom that power our American society.
Amen to that. I totally agree. And, I love technology, but I love my privacy. I'm just kind of a rebel in that regard. It's like, no, I don't need to have all these apps on. And I have friends that are like, well, but it's so cool. It's like, yeah, but do you know how much they know about you? You really need to think about this.
There is, that reminds me, there is another interesting pathway that our listeners here can go down, which is also an interesting one. There is an entire industry of sort of alternative apps that have popped up over the last 5 or 6 years to combat this problem. So if you think of any tool that you like to use, email, search, etc., there is a sort of privacy first alternative in the marketplace. So, for example, a competitor to Google on the search side is a company called DuckDuckGo.
I use
And
it.
DuckDuckGo, yeah. So you use
Uh-huh.
it, it doesn't capture any of that information. On the email side, there's Proton Mail. Bravo is a browser that's a competitor to Google Chrome. So there is actually an entire series of products that can be accessed by the consumer that are not based on those same incentives of sort of capturing your data, surveilling it, and then selling it to corporates.
Which is wonderful. You can have some privacy. I mean, that was kind of, I think, assumed under the Constitution we have a right to privacy. I wonder what our forefathers would think. They'd be saying, what are you people doing here? Yeah.
They would be very confused.
Yes, they would. Absolutely. We have to go to break here, Adam. This is fascinating information, and I want to get into some more questions that our drivers would have in terms of how to protect themselves. We'll have that in our next segment. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on tncradio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. Industry movement Trucking Moves America Forward is telling the story of the industry. Our safety champions, the women of trucking, independent contractors, the next generation of truckers, and more. Help us promote the best of our industry. Share your story and what you love about trucking. Share images of a moment you're proud of. And join us on social media. Learn more at truckingmovesamerica.com. This is the Truckers Network radio show. I'm Shelley Johnson, and we're talking with digital identity expert Adam Judelson from mePrism, who's been giving us all kinds of great information. Adam, are there some general things that drivers can do to protect themselves from identity theft, and how does identity theft actually happen?
Sure. I mean, I think the biggest thing to first think about is what is different for a trucker than for your average consumer, right? Like what kind of behavior makes a trucker's data more or less risky than another consumer? And I think the one that sticks out for me is almost certainly location data. As we know, the trucks have transmitters and are already capturing information. And so what I would say is at a minimum, I would go and turn off your location tracking settings, because that data is extremely valuable to everybody from hedge funds to hackers to really understand your average movements. And I'm sure it's visceral at this point. I'm not a trucking expert, but I've certainly read some interesting articles about companies nudging you off of your brake because they can tell that you went a few hundred meters past where you were supposed to go. And
Sure.
personally, if I were in that situation, I wouldn't want that kind of micromanagement. And it's already going to happen, sort of through the vehicle itself. But where you can protect yourself is on your own devices. And shutting off location tracking services would be the first thing that I would do. I would go into my apps and I would look for every single one that had location tracking, and I would just turn that off.
Well,
That would be where I start.
how would that work with GPS? Because drivers use it. Can they block a location tracker but still use GPS to get to a particular site?
Yeah, in that case, you would definitely still need to allow, say Google Maps or an Apple Maps to still have your location.
Okay.
So that is a little bit of a trick there. But you could always go and periodically, you could set a reminder for yourself once a month or every couple of months to basically just go delete that data from those platforms on their websites, when
Okay.
you're back off the road.
Good idea. Another question a driver had asked, some companies want the right to look at your phone and Facebook to see when you're using it, to see if you're driving while you're doing this. How much right do you have to protect that information as a driver from an employer?
That's a great question. I wish I were a lawyer to answer that question perfectly. I mean, my instinct there is that they have very little right to get that kind of information. I think at some level, and this is just advice that I would give to anybody. Review your contracts, and every once in a while, it's a good idea to get an attorney to review those contracts as well, because the attorneys have a really wide view of what lots of different employment contracts look like across the board. And
Hmm.
another thing that I would encourage, and it's something that I've done in the past with some of my employers, is have a conversation with them. Some of the largest employers, they're going to have an ugly compliance department, and you won't get very far having a conversation. But if you work for one of the smaller ones or even a mid-sized company, you might have success talking to the legal department and telling them, hey, this feels like it's unnecessarily invasive into my privacy. And one of the arguments that I've successfully advanced, and I think this is a funny one because it applies both in the startup world, probably and the trucking world, is I've come across policies that basically say the same thing. We have access to your phone. We can check whatever we want on your phone. But in the startup world, there's also an expectation that you're pretty much working 24/7 and you're available 7 days a week. And what I've successfully advanced in the past is, if you're going to expect me to be available 24/7 and you want access to my data at all times, then you're essentially saying that I have no right to privacy whatsoever if I have to be available. And I think a very similar model probably plays out in the trucking world. And so that's something I would advance. And I would say, look, you can have you can watch the movements, or you can expect me to be on call, but you can't do both.
Otherwise, you're paying me 24/7, right?
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're on call, there should be some compensation for that.
Precisely.
So are VPNs or virtual private networks good? And if so, what do you look for in a VPN? And do you only need them in a public Wi-Fi?
That's a good question. It's definitely a good tool to use if you want to protect yourself and have some anonymity across your browsing information. But keep in mind that if you're logging into the website of a company that you do business with, what you're actually doing in a way is almost giving that company more information if you do it through a VPN, because now they have another set of criterion to match your profile against. And so while I encourage it from the standpoint of having some protection from some of the folks that are trying to pay attention, just bear in mind that once you log in, you are still communicating to the service that you're using that this is who you are. And maybe they'll have a little bit of difficulty detecting exactly which IP address you're doing or you're using.
Mhm.
But unfortunately for the consumer behind the scenes, there is a ton of technology that has been built for what's called identity resolution and entity resolution across data sources. And that technology specifically looks to see, is John, who normally uses this email address on this IP address, the same as John, who's using this other IP address with this different email. And so you may have noticed sometimes that you'll get an email about a thing that you didn't sign up for with that particular email, right? So you sign up for something, some sort of a water bottle, for example, and then you start getting advertisements for water bottles sent to a different email address that you also own. That's because behind the scenes, those corporations are buying lots of data from data brokers, and then they're using special technology that tries to match that identity across locations. So I think VPNs can be a good way to have some degree of anonymity in terms of how you're searching across things. But at the end of the day, if you're still logging into the site and using it, there's still going to be tracking going on.
Wow. Is there any way to be completely anonymous?
Well, you can certainly stay off the internet.
Well, that's true.
you know,
Totally unplugged. But
there are definitely options out there. There's an interesting company out there called Lightphone that has a device that is basically designed to specifically remove a lot of the distractions and a lot of the tracking. So there's, we talked earlier about the software alternatives like Proton Mail and Brave Browser. There are also hardware alternatives as well. I'm not as familiar with that many of them, but that is one example. And there's definitely a growing market there as well.
interesting. But not a lot yet. So it seems like it's taking people a while to maybe realize how much data is out there about them and how invasive this is.
It is, and it's a trade-off. This is the thing that I've been trying to emphasize is that, generally speaking, most people's answer to how much tracking they want to allow is usually not all or nothing. Usually we're not saying don't ever track me. Usually we're saying it would be nice if you didn't track these aspects, but I'm okay with you tracking those other aspects. And you have to put yourselves in both the negative framing and the positive framing to think through what your preferences are. So in the negative, you could say, imagine the most nefarious possible actor gets a hold of your information. For me, I would consider this to be a foreign government or, someone trying to manipulate my political views, an organization like that. What would I never, ever want them to have? And for me, those answers would tend to be behavioral things, insights about the types of messages I send or the types of thoughts that I have. At the end of the day, if they had, my zip code, I don't think they're going to do a whole lot with that. They probably already have my name for starters. And then you go to the other side and you say, well, what about a brand that you love? So for me, I live in California. I love the outdoors. REI is a brand that I really love. And if REI wanted to have some of my location data and it wasn't sort of overly, if there wasn't too much surveillance involved in it, it wasn't every single data point, but it was maybe, every time I went to a hiking trail, I would be okay sharing that. And so you kind of have to think like, what is your threshold for these different brands at different times? And then make a decision that you feel comfortable with. Because it is still very difficult to be entirely off the grid without living a lifestyle that requires some really big social sacrifices. And I think we can all agree after the last couple of years of pandemic living, it's hard to take any additional social sacrifices.
Absolutely. We have to go to break here. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show, and we're talking with Adam Judelson from mePrism. He's an expert on digital identity and the things you need to know. So stay tuned for more coming up. Kathy DeCaro is nothing short of amazing. She not only drives the world's biggest truck as a heavy equipment operator in northern Alberta, Canada. She's an international motivational speaker and the author of Dream Big, an autobiography about overcoming a lifetime of trauma and abuse that led to dreams of success. Kathy inspires people the world over to change their lives and improve their self-worth. Her book will change your life. She's passionate about personal growth and believes anyone can change their circumstances and overcome their obstacles if they believe in themselves. Her life will amaze you and seriously inspire you. Be sure to order a copy of her book, Dream Big, on Amazon.com. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and we're talking with digital identity expert Adam Judelson from mePrism. Adam, I was wondering if maybe you could give some general tips on identity theft, maybe how to protect family members, maybe elderly family members who are rather vulnerable and not understanding how all of this works, or teenagers who get into stuff they shouldn't. I know a lot of drivers worry about this kind of stuff. They're on the road, they have no control of what's happening on the home front when they're driving. So,
Yep. Yeah, great questions. So let's start with the elderly family members because I think it's almost a little bit easier, although these are both tricky topics. And I think the first thing to do is think about who in your life is vulnerable, and then just start by having a conversation and going and experiencing a little bit of their daily life when you can. Right? Go to their house, see how they're interacting. Are they on the computer? Are they on a phone? Who's making calls to them? But a lot of it really just starts with education. I think the two things that I've seen that are the most pernicious sort of attacks on the elderly, one of them is through text messages. Pretty much everybody is receiving text messages at this point in time. Doesn't mean they're responding to them necessarily, but your average grandparent doesn't have the same level of savvy about sort of what kinds of links not to click on. And the messages have started to get really sophisticated in terms of what they say. It used to be that you could say, okay, a text message that's talking about sending money to Nigeria out of the blue is generally a red flag. But now a lot of the messages kind of almost cater to, I've seen a lot of examples lately of misinformation and speaking to somebody's kind of insecurities around a particular political position on an issue. And this is both sides of the aisle. This is not a partisan issue. What's happened is that the people who are trying to exploit us have figured out what to say to someone they think is a Democrat to get them riled up, and what to say to someone who's a Republican to get them riled up. So it's
sure.
really equal opportunity here. And so I would watch out for those and just do some education about, just because somebody sends you a text message doesn't mean that that person is someone that you should interact with. And frequently that the links that you're clicking there are indicating, they're going to bring you down a rabbit hole that could ultimately lead to a data security breach is really the way to think about it. I also see people thinking, well, I've got to like reply and tell them to stop. But at the end of the day, these campaigns are predicated on hitting a very large swath of society. And then really it's the people who interact with those links that continue to be targeted. Because that information, the fact that you responded, even if you say, hey, I hate you, stop sending this, that is actually indicating that there is a warm body on the other side of the line. They don't really know when they're first reaching out that this is a registered phone number necessarily. So it's important to think about that. The number two thing, and this is perhaps the even more important one, most of today we've talked about, people who are taking data that you've given to them, and you maybe didn't intentionally give it to them, like a service like Gmail, for example, but you do have a relationship with them. And one of the things I see on the elderly side is just a complete disregard for passwords, where every single password is the exact same thing. The passwords are super simplistic. One of the things I'll throw out there is that if your password is below a certain level of complexity, it's possible for the computer to basically create a list of every possible password below a certain complexity and try all of them to try to exploit you. And so that's one of the reasons why it's important to have long passwords, complicated passwords with numbers and letters and special characters, et cetera. And this is a real burden, but there are numerous tools out there that make this much easier. I'm a big fan of 1Password. LastPass is another company that's out there, because no mere mortal can actually remember all of these things.
Sure.
But I would try to get in touch and figure out what accounts are they really using, and can you help them with their passwords, and sort of educate them around being savvy with what kind of text messages they're responding to.
So essentially use a password manager. That makes it easier.
Exactly. Because then you can create difficult passwords that you won't even be able to remember, but you can pull them up from the password manager at the times that you need them. And it doesn't have to be everything. If you sign up for, a benign newsletter from a local farmer's market, you don't have to be as concerned. But if it's your access to your Social Security paycheck, I would make sure you're using a pretty strong password there.
Makes sense. Are there some general safe practices for being on social media sites like Facebook, etc.? People are getting cloned and being hacked and that sort of thing. Um, Proper behavior to keep yourself safe?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is to just assume that whatever you're posting is a public post, even if it's not a public post.
Mhm.
And so that's the standard that I hold myself to is if I'm comfortable saying this to everybody on the planet, then I'm comfortable posting it. And that doesn't mean that you can't post things, right? You know, for some of us, we're completely comfortable saying happy birthday, Susie, to everybody on the planet. And in that case, you know, it's relatively fine. But what I would think about is what kind of information can be used to find additional information about you. So if you say happy birthday to Susie, in essence, you're actually telling other people what Susie's date of birth is. And so you have to be careful because sometimes you're not just implicating yourself, you're implicating other people that you care about. So I'm cautious of things like location. I'm cautious of naming family members or implicating them directly as family, which doesn't mean I don't interact with them, but I just, you know, I don't start the post with like, hey, cousin, right? You
Sure.
can still address the topic without bringing in that sort of information. So that's kind of how I steer through that area.
Good suggestions. I want to cover so many things, but we only have a short amount of time, and I want people to know more about your company. Where do people find mePrism?
Yeah, the easiest way is just www.meprism.com, MEPRISM.com. If you are an Apple iPhone user, you can get our app in the App Store just by searching for mePrism. If you are on Android, come to our website and sign up for the waitlist. We will have Android available for you early in 2022.
Excellent. And I definitely would love to have you back, Adam. I'm sure drivers are going to have a lot more questions because I think this is really an education. Most people don't understand how this works and how insidious it really is.
It's an entire secret economy. If
Yeah.
anyone of your listeners is interested, there's a phenomenal book out there called Surveillance Capitalism. And it really articulates the entire history of how our economy has shifted to being really focused on data as a means of property exploitation. And it's a fascinating read. It's a very long one, but it's a good maybe for on Audible for those long drives.
Sure. I've heard of the book, and I would love to actually listen to it or read it because I think it would really be an eye opener and maybe a bit scary. Kind of reminds you of 1984 a little bit.
Certainly, but
Yes.
you've got to be informed before you can protect yourself.
Absolutely. And that's why we have you here. Thank you so much, Adam, for being on the show. And I would love to have you back right here on the Truckers Network radio show.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You've been listening to TNCRadio.live and the Truckers Network radio show with Shelley Johnson. Stay tuned for more great programming coming up. Thank you for listening to another great interview on TNCRadio.live and the Truckers Network radio show. All of the material you hear on TNCRadio.live on our website, our broadcasts, or our podcasts are copyrighted. There can be no distribution without the express consent of TNCRadio.live and its partners. For inquiries, write us at info@tncradio.live.